You don't expect a man who claims to talk to ghosts to walk into Nero Wolfe's office at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Thursday. For one thing, the man would have to be crazy. For another, he'd have to climb those 7 brownstone steps past Fritz's frown and ring the bell knowing he was about to face Wolfe. And if he did all that anyway, well, then I'd have to listen to him. So when I opened the door and saw him standing there, thin as a rail, with a black felt hat clutched in one hand and a nervous smile stuck on his face, I already figured this would be another one of those afternoons that ended in Wolfe's monumental wrath and indigestion. "My name is Oliver Brett," he said. His voice was faint and ghostly too, as if he'd been rehearsing with the spirits. I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe. It's urgent. Life and death." That last part usually buys at least a minute of Wolfe's attention. "Come in," I told him, stepping back. "Though if it's your life, I'd say you've already used up your quota of bad decisions today. What's the nature of your urgency?"
알더 고스츠에 붙어유.
That got a startled look out of him, and a faint grin too, which I counted as a victory. "I'm not crazy," he said, climbing the few steps into the office while I shut the door behind him. "It's just that I've seen something."
엔드 나우 서먼즈 데드.
That sounded more promising. When we entered the office, Wolfe was already at his desk, his immense bulk planted like a mountain behind the surface of polished wood. He looked up, disapproval flickering in his eyes at the intrusion. He was wearing a grey silk robe, which meant he had either just finished lunch or was about to take a nap. Either way, this wasn't ideal timing. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, "may I present Oliver Brett, professional ghost whisperer and amateur troublemaker. He claims someone's dead and that it somehow relates to him." Brett straightened, as though my introduction had been a job interview. "Sir," he said, "I'm in terrible danger. I saw something I wasn't meant to see. And now I think I'm being followed. And, last night, a woman I know was killed. In her own apartment. The police are already sniffing around." At the word police, Wolfe's eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "And," Brett added quickly, "they may think I did it." Wolfe let out a low grunt and swiveled his chair slightly. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "do we have any pressing engagements that would justify refusing this apparition?" "Not unless you count the pork tenderloin Fritz has marinating," I said. "Hardly," Wolfe replied, then turned his gaze on Brett with the slow appraisal of a man inspecting an unpleasant species of insect. "Sit, Mr. Brett. State your case clearly. And try, I implore you, to avoid melodrama." Brett sank into the red leather chair opposite Wolfe and put his hat down on his lap. "The woman's name," he began, "was Joan Latham. She was a medium. Like me. We performed séances together sometimes. It was at one of those séances, last week, that I overheard something. Something private. Something I shouldn't have heard." I already liked the way he phrased that. Cryptic enough to be interesting but not enough to tell us anything useful. "What did you hear?" Wolfe asked, mildly. Brett hesitated, glancing at me, then back at Wolfe. "It was something about money. A great deal of money. And threats. But I never meant to spy. And last night she was dead, and I got a note under my door this morning saying, 'Keep quiet or join her.'" That got even Wolfe's attention. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and let his heavy lids half close. "And you expect me," he said, "to, what? Expose the villain? Protect you? Or perhaps convince the police of your innocence?" "All of the above," Brett said, and even managed to smile faintly. Wolfe's eyes opened again, glinting. "That," he declared, "is 3 tasks, Mr. Brett. I despise multitasking." "Then start with the one that pays best," Brett replied. That earned a single, short, appreciative grunt from Wolfe. "You may leave us, Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said at last, waving me toward the door. "Take Mr. Brett's particulars. I imagine you'll need to rattle around the city for a few hours. Meanwhile, I shall consider whether I wish to endure this nonsense or not." I stood. "Fine by me," I said. "But if I get killed by a ghost, I expect double pay." Brett's lips twitched into what might have been a grin. "I'll wait here," he said. "You'll do more than that," Wolf told him dryly. "You'll keep your mouth shut unless you have something sensible to say." As I led Brett out of the office to take down his address and start the legwork, I couldn't help but think, this one already had more shadows than usual. And as Wolf would say, where there are shadows, there's usually something hiding in them. By the time I got Oliver Brett's particulars, Wolf had already summoned Fritz to bring him a bottle of Lowenbrau and settled into his chair as though he intended to root there for the rest of his natural life. Which, knowing Wolf, wasn't far from the truth. Brett lived in a pokey walk-up on West 81st, and his business card, which he handed me with a faint tremor, read, "Oliver Brett, Spiritual Consultant. Private séances arranged. Discretion assured." Underneath, in smaller print, it added, "If you have questions, the dead may have answers." The card didn't inspire confidence, but I slipped it into my pocket anyway. "You say you heard threats about money," I reminded him as we stood in the front hall. "Between who?" Brett shook his head miserably. "That's just it, I don't know. It was behind a curtain. I wasn't supposed to hear it at all. Just two men's voices. One of them said, 'If you don't pay up, she'll regret it.' Then silence." I frowned. "And you didn't recognize either voice?" "No." "And this was at a séance?" "Yes. Joan's apartment. She had a little parlor for it." "And now she's dead, and someone wants you to keep your mouth shut." "Yes." It was as close to a confession as I was going to get without dragging it out of him with pliers. "All right," I said. "Sit tight. Don't do anything stupider than coming here. And if anyone else sends you a note, don't burn it, don't eat it, don't commune with it. Bring it here." That earned me a nervous laugh. "Do you believe me?" I gave him my best professional smile. "I believe you're scared. And that's good enough for now." I left him there with Wolf, who was already instructing Fritz to warm up some pâté. Wolf hadn't committed to taking the case, but he also hadn't thrown Brett out yet, which, in Wolf's world, was practically a contract. By 4:30 I was out on the street and heading toward Joan Latham's address. It was a modest building on the east side, not the sort of place you'd expect to find murder or mysticism, though New York has a way of hiding both in plain sight. The buzzer for her apartment was taped over, which struck me as either a clue or lousy property management. The door to her unit was unlocked, but the little police seal fluttered against the jamb when I pushed it. No one was inside. The room smelled faintly of lavender and candle wax. She'd had the place set up like a stage, a little round table in the middle with black velvet drapes hung behind it and a crystal ball dead center. It would have been spooky if it hadn't also looked like a $10 magic show. I poked around. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, but I did notice a smear of something dark on the floor near the table. Wine, or maybe blood. It led to a small carpet, which looked like it had been recently straightened. I squatted, lifted a corner, and found nothing underneath except a faint scorch mark on the floorboards. That was odd. Before I could inspect further, a polite cough behind me reminded me I wasn't alone. "Sir." I straightened. The voice belonged to a man in a dark suit with a badge clipped to his breast pocket. He had a face like a bulldog that had just smelled something sour. "I'm Sergeant Polly Stebbins," he said. "And you are?" "Archie Goodwin," I said brightly. "Just paying my respects." He narrowed his eyes. "Wolf's errand boy. Figured you'd turn up." "That's me," I said. "What's the story?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room as if sizing up how much trouble I was planning to cause. "She was strangled," he said finally. "No sign of forced entry. No fingerprints except hers and Brett's. We're talking to him now." That caught my attention. "He's here." "No, Stebbins corrected." "Down at the precinct. We picked him up this morning. He claims he left after the séance at 10:30. Neighbors say otherwise." "I suppose you're keeping him?" I asked. "For now. Until we sort it out." "Then it looks like you don't need me," I said cheerfully. "I'll just relay to Wolf that you've got everything under control." His lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "You do that, Goodwin," he said. "And tell Wolf to stay out of it. This one's clean." Which was exactly the kind of thing Wolf couldn't resist proving wrong. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, dusk was settling in, and Wolf was finishing his second bottle of beer. Brett was gone, escorted out quietly by Fritz, but Wolf's expression told me he had already decided to take the case. He didn't look up as I came in. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "if you would be so obliging as to inform me what you have learned, briefly, and then summon Mr. Brett back here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." I gave him the highlights: the seance setup, the scorch mark, the cops picking up Brett, and Stebbins' warning. Wolf's lips curled faintly. "The police," he murmured, "are already convinced of his guilt. How tedious." Then, louder, "That will be all for today, Mr. Goodwin. We shall resume tomorrow, provided you survive the night." I saluted him, resisting the urge to ask if he planned to commune with the dead himself before morning. He closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. For Wolf, that meant the game was on. The next morning started with a gentle nudge from Wolf, delivered via his usual method, a summons disguised as a command. At precisely 9:01 a.m., Fritz knocked on my door and informed me that Mr. Wolf would like me to apply myself. Translation: I was to hit the streets and stir up some dust while he sat there tending to his orchids and drinking beer. Brett arrived promptly at 9, looking like a man who had either slept badly or not at all. Wolf barely acknowledged him, but I gathered enough from their few words to know Wolf intended me to nose around while Brett stayed put in case the police got frisky again. "Your objective," Wolf told me as I slipped into my jacket, "is to locate the circle of persons present at that ridiculous seance and establish which among them is sufficiently unscrupulous to kill a woman in her own apartment." He swiveled his chair and gave me the faintest glimmer of a smile. "I don't expect you to exercise discernment," he added. "Merely diligence." "Thank you, sir," I said. "Your confidence sustains me." He waved me away like a bad smell. By 10 o'clock, I was back on the east side and knocking on doors. According to Brett, whose memory got sharper under my prodding, there had been 5 others at the séance, not counting Joan and himself. 2 men, 3 women. He'd only given me 2 names before Wolf cut him off and shooed me out: Caroline Desmond and Dr. Victor Ames. I decided to start with Caroline. Her address led me to a neat little building with flower boxes in the windows and a landlady who looked me up and down like she thought I might steal the rug. When I asked for Miss Desmond, she sniffed and pointed me toward the 3rd floor. Caroline Desmond opened the door wearing a silk robe and a distracted expression. She was tall, with dark hair swept back into a loose knot and a cigarette smoldering in one hand. She looked at me like she'd been expecting someone, though I suspected it wasn't me. "Miss Desmond?" I asked. "Yes. Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe." That got her attention. Her eyebrows rose, and she leaned against the doorframe. "I see. And why does Mr. Wolfe care about me?" "I gather you attended a séance at Joan Latham's last week," I said. "And now Joan's dead. Mr. Wolfe has been engaged to look into it." Her mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't flinch. "I hardly knew her," she said. "That makes 2 of us," I replied. "But somebody knew her well enough to kill her. I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." She hesitated, then finally stepped aside and let me in. The apartment was tastefully furnished, which told me she either had money or borrowed it well. "She didn't deserve what happened," Caroline said finally, dropping into a chair and gesturing toward the couch. "I can't imagine why anyone would want to hurt her." "You believe Brett's innocent?" I asked. She gave me a long look through a haze of cigarette smoke. "Do you?" "I believe he's scared stiff," I said. "That's a good sign, in my experience." She smiled faintly. "Oliver's harmless. The others, well, you'd have to ask them." "I intend to," I said. "Who else was there?" She rattled off the other names with just enough reluctance to tell me she didn't like where this was going. "Dr. Victor Ames, a psychiatrist. Mrs. Viola Renner, a society matron. Paul Renner, her husband. And a man named Alfred Keeley, about whom she only said, 'He shouldn't have been there.'" That piqued my interest, but I let it go for now. Did you notice anything odd during the séance? I asked. She shook her head slowly. Not until Joan stopped talking, she said. What do you mean? Caroline's gaze drifted to the window. There was a pause, she said, as though she'd heard something she didn't expect. Then she ended the session abruptly. Said she wasn't feeling well and sent us all home. And you didn't think that was strange? I thought everything about that evening was strange, she replied dryly. I thanked her for her time and promised Wolf would keep her name out of the papers, though I didn't guarantee the cops wouldn't come knocking. Next stop was Dr. Victor Ames. He operated out of an office a few blocks away, with his name neatly stenciled on the door. When I walked in, he was seated behind his desk, looking like he'd just delivered a stern lecture to himself. I know why you're here, he said flatly. That saves time, I said, taking the chair opposite him. What can you tell me about that night? Nothing you'd find useful, he replied. That's up to me, I said. He folded his hands and gave me the kind of look shrinks give when they're deciding whether you're worth their professional rates. Joan was unstable, he said finally. I told her as much after the last session. She imagined threats where there were none. It wouldn't surprise me if she'd provoked someone without even realizing it. That's a pretty convenient theory, I said. He gave me a faint, humorless smile. Truth often is, he replied. By the time I left his office, I'd gathered enough to know two things. First, every one of those people had something to hide. Second, they were all better at hiding it than Brett. As I headed back toward the brownstone, I couldn't help thinking of what Wolf always says. When people conceal, they reveal. I just hoped he'd figure out what they'd revealed before the police decided they already had their man. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was late enough for Wolf to be contemplating lunch and early enough for him to still be cross at the world. Which, for Wolf, is his natural state. I stepped into the office and found him in his chair, hands steepled, eyes half shut, looking, as always, like a man meditating on the futility of humanity. Brett was still there too, sitting on the edge of the red leather chair and wearing the same nervous expression he'd had when I left. Wolf cracked an eyelid as I handed over my notes. Well, Mr. Goodwin? Have you managed to extract anything useful from that little menagerie? Depends how you define useful, I said, sliding into my own chair. They're all hiding something. Caroline Desmond says Joan ended the séance suddenly and seemed rattled. Victor Ames thinks she was unstable, and both of them made it clear they'd rather eat glass than talk to me. And then there's Alfred Keeley, who Miss Desmond claims shouldn't have been there, but nobody seems willing to explain why. I haven't gotten to the Renners yet. Wolf closed his eyes again and sighed. Mr. Brett, what can you tell me about this Alfred Keeley? Brett squirmed in his chair like a man who just sat on a pin. Not much, he admitted. Joan invited him. I thought it was odd. He didn't speak to anyone, just sat there the whole time, staring at her. I'd never seen him at any of our sessions before. And yet you didn't think to mention him to me until now, Wolf said, his voice like an icicle. I didn't think it mattered. Oh, it matters, I said. Anyone who shouldn't have been there at a séance where someone hears something they shouldn't and ends up dead, that's what we call a lead. At that moment, the phone rang, and I answered. It was Polly Stebbins, sounding as happy as a man who's just stepped in something unpleasant. Goodwin, he barked. You tell Wolf that Brett is off the hook for now. Somebody else has saved him the trouble. I straightened in my chair. What do you mean? I mean, Stebbins said, that Alfred Keeley just turned up dead in his hotel room. Strangled, same as the Latham woman. And no, smart guy, we didn't put him there, we'd barely started looking for him. That little detail hit the room like a thunderclap. Wolf opened his eyes fully now and regarded me with irritation, though whether it was directed at me, Stebbins, or the universe in general was hard to say. When? I asked. This morning, Stebbins growled. Housekeeper found him. No sign of forced entry. Nothing taken. Neat as you please. All right, I said. Thanks, Polly. You've been a delight. I hung up and turned to Wolf. Well, I said, That simplifies things. On the contrary, Wolf murmured. It complicates them immeasurably. It seems, Mr. Brett, that someone has removed Mr. Keeley from the list of suspects. Brett's face had gone ashen. What does that mean? He asked. It means, Wolf said coldly, that the longer you remain alive, the less convenient you become. Brett swallowed hard, which seemed like the smartest move he'd made yet. I glanced at Wolf. So, I asked, does that mean we keep him here? Or do we let him wander off and get himself strangled too? Wolf gave me a frosty look. Use your discretion, Mr. Goodwin. But if he is found dead before dinner, you will kindly refrain from bringing him back here. That was Wolf's way of saying, keep him alive. I got Brett settled in the guest room for the time being and then went to phone Caroline Desmond. She answered after 3 rings, sounding breathless. Yes. It's Archie Goodwin, I said. Have you heard the news? What news?
Alfred Keeley.
He's dead. Strangled. There was a long silence on the line, then the faint sound of her drawing in a breath. I see, she said at last. Do you? I asked. Because I could use a little help seeing myself. Why did you say he shouldn't have been at that séance? Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Because he wasn't invited, she said. I frowned. Then who brought him? Another pause. I don't know, she said finally. I thought Joan invited him. But when I asked her afterward, she didn't answer. Just told me to forget about it. I didn't like the sound of that. All right, I said. If you remember anything else, call me. Otherwise, stay put and stay alive. I hung up, feeling the pieces shift in a way I didn't quite like. In the office, Wolf was already back at his desk, flipping through an orchid catalogue with deliberate calm. Mr. Goodwin, he said without looking up, you will now proceed to the Renners. And do try to keep the casualty rate to a minimum. Yes, sir, I said. Though if they start strangling each other in front of me, I make no promises. As I headed out again, Brett watching me like a man condemned, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already one step behind whoever was moving the pieces. And Wolf, sitting there with his orchids and his beer, already knew it. It was almost noon by the time I got back from the Renners Park Avenue mausoleum, and I don't use the word lightly. If there's ever been a more humorless pair of rich people pretending not to know what I was talking about, I haven't met them. Paul Renner did his best to look surprised when I told him 2 of his fellow seance-goers had been strangled, but I've seen better performances in high school plays. Mrs. Renner, meanwhile, looked through me like I was one of the maids asking for a raise. So I came back to the brownstone with the same number of answers I'd left with, 0, and the definite sense that the Renners had more to say than they were willing to part with. When I walked into Wolf's office, he was sitting exactly as I'd left him, though now with an open book and his second beer at hand. Brett was still parked on the edge of his chair like a nervous bird, and the air in the room felt heavier than usual. Ah, Wolf said, looking up from his book just long enough to deliver the kind of glare reserved for undercooked fish and insubordinate assistants. You've returned. Against my better judgment, I replied, hanging my hat. I gave him the rundown, the Renners' polite indifference, their insistence they knew nothing about Keeley or Joan's murder, and the faint odor of something rotten behind their velvet curtains. When I finished, Wolf shut his book and exhaled through his nose. Mr. Goodwin, he said, I have indulged this ridiculous charade long enough. Oh. I beg your pardon? I said. He leaned back and let his eyelids droop, his version of a tantrum. This case, he announced, has already become an intolerable nuisance. I despise seances, mediums, spiritualists, and, he gestured vaguely at Brett, superstitious claptrap in all its forms. I agreed to assist Mr. Brett on the implicit assumption that rationality could be applied to irrational people. That assumption was clearly in error. Brett opened his mouth like he might protest, but Wolf raised a hand. Furthermore, Wolf went on, the police have demonstrated their usual zeal in arresting the wrong man. I see no reason to compete with them in incompetence. If they wish to fumble in the dark, let them. That's very noble of you, I said, sitting down. But don't you think it's a little premature? There's still a live client in the room, which is more than we can say for 2 of the witnesses. Precisely, Wolf said. I have no desire to see him join the others. Therefore I recommend he remove himself from my premises before whoever is strangling these people becomes still more enterprising. Brett's voice cracked as he spoke up. You can't just abandon me now, he said. You've already taken the case. I took nothing, Wolf said icily. I permitted Mr. Goodwin to indulge his curiosity, nothing more. If you wish to retain my services formally, you may leave a certified check on the desk and an undertaking to follow my instructions without quibbling. Otherwise, you may consult the spirits. That last line had enough bite in it to make Brett flinch. I stood, because it was clear Wolf wasn't going to. All right, I said. I get it. You're wounded, you're inconvenienced, and you'd rather be upstairs pollinating orchids. Fine. But if we're quitting, we'd better send Brett out with a bodyguard, because someone out there clearly wants to close his mouth for good, and you know damn well the cops don't care if they succeed. Wolf glared at me, which, in wolf speak, was practically a compliment. You are, he muttered, a damned nuisance. Then, just as I was about to start arguing in earnest, the doorbell rang. Fritz appeared a moment later, looking mildly disturbed. Mr. Goodwin, he said, a package has arrived. Addressed to Mr. Wolf. No return address. Wolf frowned and waved his hand irritably. Bring it here. Fritz placed the small brown parcel on Wolf's desk. Eyed it warily. Want me to open it? I asked. Certainly not, Wolf said. I'm not helpless. Yet. He tore the paper open with surprising deftness and pulled out a photograph. It was a black and white print, glossy, and it showed Joan Latham seated at her séance table, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, and standing behind her was Alfred Keeley, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in thick black ink, were 3 words. So I did my part. With everyone still seated in Wolf's office, I started circling them like a very polite shark. I asked questions I already knew the answers to, pointed out contradictions they didn't think I'd caught, and generally made myself obnoxious, a role I was born for. It didn't take long before the cracks started showing. Caroline Desmond's hands kept fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve as I prodded her about Keeley. She still insisted she'd thought he was just another client, but now her voice had picked up a tremor she hadn't had before. Mrs. Renner, meanwhile, refused to meet my eyes, choosing instead to glare at a spot on the wall as though it had personally offended her. Mr. Renner kept clearing his throat and glancing at his wife as though waiting for a cue. And Dr. Ames, cool, detached Dr. Ames, watched them all as if they were his patients and he was diagnosing something grim. Then it happened. I just finished needling Caroline about why she lied to me earlier when Wolf, who'd been sitting silent and still all this time, opened his eyes. That will do, Mr. Goodwin, he said softly. He turned his gaze on Mrs. Renner. Madam, he said, you've just betrayed yourself. That brought the whole room to a standstill. Mrs. Renner stiffened, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. What are you talking about? She said. Wolf let out a small, satisfied sigh. Earlier, he said, you claimed you knew nothing about Mr. Keeley beyond his presence at the séance. And yet, just now, when Mr. Goodwin pressed Miss Desmond about Keeley's relationship with Joan Latham, you muttered, under your breath but quite audibly, it was her own fault.
MRS 레드너즈 립스 파우티드, 버너싱 came out.
You spoke, Wolf continued mercilessly, with the kind of certainty that comes only from knowledge. Not speculation. Not gossip. Knowledge. He leaned back, eyes half closed again, his voice cool and precise. You knew exactly what Joan Latham was doing. You knew she and Keeley were blackmailing you, because you were their mark. Weren't you? The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Finally Mrs. Renner spoke, though her voice was barely a whisper now. They said they had proof, she said. Letters. Photographs. They said if I didn't pay them, they'd ruin me. Ruin us. Her eyes darted to her husband, who looked more defeated than surprised. And so, Wolf concluded, when she pressed you too far that night, you decided she had to be silenced. And when Keeley tried to collect on his own afterward, you silenced him too. Efficient, if crude. Caroline gasped softly. Dr. Ames frowned, though whether in disapproval or admiration was hard to tell. Mrs. Renner sank back in her chair, all the fight draining out of her. Wolf reached for his beer and took a measured sip. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "you may summon Inspector Kramer at your convenience." "Yes, sir," I said, already reaching for the phone. Brett, still seated in his corner, finally exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since yesterday. As I dialed, Wolf gave one final glance at Mrs. Renner and added, almost as an afterthought, "Next time, madam, if you must commit murder, at least have the decency not to contradict yourself in my presence. I find it tiresome. If you've never seen Inspector Kramer storm into a room certain he's right, you've missed one of the most reliable shows in New York." It didn't take him more than 15 minutes after my call. When he arrived at the brownstone, he looked like he'd just swallowed a bad cigar and wanted everyone to know whose fault it was. Fritz let him in, and Kramer wasted no time. "All right, Wolf," he barked, stomping toward the desk. "I don't know what you think you've got, but we already picked up Ames downtown. He's sitting in a cell right now cooling his heels. Thought you should know before you go polishing your big speech." Wolf didn't bother to rise. He merely glanced up from his beer, one eyebrow arched with the kind of disdain only he can make look natural. "Ames," Wolf repeated. "Victor Ames," Kramer confirmed, planting both hands on the desk and leaning in. The shrink. Neat little motive, opportunity, fingerprints all over her apartment, and he was caught trying to leave town an hour ago. I leaned casually against the doorframe. "Did you ask him why?" I said. Kramer shot me a look hot enough to char wood. "We asked," he growled. He clammed up. "Typical." Wolf sighed and set down his glass. "Inspector," he said, "your diligence is commendable but, as ever, misapplied. Dr. Ames is many things, smug, secretive, manipulative, and perhaps even unethical, but he is not a murderer." Kramer's cheeks flushed a shade darker. "Oh no," he snapped. "Then maybe you'd like to explain what he was doing with Joan Latham's diary in his coat pocket when we picked him up?" That was news even to me, and I admit it made me blink. Wolf, however, remained unruffled. "A diary," he repeated. "And what did it contain?" Kramer's jaw tightened. "Notes. About her sessions. About everyone in this room. Including him. Damning enough, I'd say." Wolf's lip curled faintly. "Damning enough," he echoed, "to want to retrieve it before the police found it." "Yes. That much is evident. But murder? No." Kramer straightened and jabbed a finger toward Wolf. "All right, genius, you tell me. If not him, who? Because you've got a room full of people here and 2 bodies already in the morgue." Wolf leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That, Inspector," he said, "is precisely the point. There are too many people here with motive to rely on something as crude as fingerprints on a diary." Mrs. Renner stiffened at that, and Caroline's eyes flicked toward her in a way that did not escape me, or Wolf, judging by the faint smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Kramer followed my gaze and scowled. "Oh no," he said. "Don't tell me you're trying to pin this on her. Not enough for you that she's got money to keep her mouth shut." "I," Wolf said evenly, "am trying to pin this on the person who committed it. Not the most convenient suspect, not the most obvious, but the correct one. Which, in this case, is not Dr. Ames." Kramer threw up his hands and growled something under his breath about Wolf's ego and the taxpayer's patience. I stepped in before it turned into another shouting match. "If you'll sit down, Inspector," I said. "Mr. Wolf was just about to invite everyone to stay for his usual performance. You can take notes." Kramer glared at me, then at Wolf, then finally plunked himself into the nearest chair with the air of a man waiting for a train he already hates. Wolf reached for his bell, rang for Fritz, and instructed him to bring another round of beer and to ensure no one left the room. Then he settled back, closed his eyes, and murmured, "Mr. Goodwin, you may arrange the suspects to your liking. We'll proceed." Which, in Wolf speak, meant the curtain was about to rise. You could tell the performance was about to begin because Wolf sat up a little straighter in his chair, like a sultan preparing to pass judgment on his court. The suspects, Caroline Desmond, the Renners, Dr. Ames, and Brett, were arranged in a half-circle of chairs facing Wolf's desk. Kramer sat off to one side, arms crossed, lips pressed so tight they could have sealed an envelope. Fritz had refreshed everyone's drinks, except for Wolf, who already had his beer, and then retreated silently to the kitchen. Wolf's gaze swept over the room, resting on each of them long enough to make them squirm before moving on. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep and deliberate, "we are here because two people are dead. Miss Joan Latham and Mr. Alfred Keeley. Both strangled. Both connected to a ridiculous spectacle called a séance, which I trust none of you will ever be foolish enough to repeat. The police, predictably, have arrested the wrong man. My task is to identify the right one." He paused, letting the silence thicken. "The motive," he continued, "was not money alone, though that was part of it. Nor was it fear alone, though that played its role. The motive was, inevitably, power. The power to conceal a secret that could destroy more than one of you." Mrs. Renner flinched, her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. Caroline Desmond darted a look at her that didn't escape me or Wolf. Wolf leaned back slightly, his voice cool but gathering force. Miss Latham and Mr. Keeley were blackmailers. Together they exploited the vanity and superstition of wealthy people, extracting sums in exchange for silence about matters best left unspoken. This arrangement persisted until that final séance, when Miss Latham made a miscalculation. She overplayed her hand. She threatened to expose something in front of witnesses, which forced the killer's hand. He picked up the photograph from his desk, Joan at the table, Keeley behind her, and held it up. "This," he said, "is not merely a photograph. It is a declaration of conspiracy. And yet it also revealed more than its makers intended. Look closely, the killer did." He set the photo down and let the words sink in. Then his eyes found Mrs. Renner. "Madam," he said, "your contempt for Miss Latham was poorly hidden. When you muttered, it was her own fault, you betrayed knowledge no innocent bystander could have possessed. You knew precisely what she and Keeley were doing to you. You paid once. But when she threatened to make it public anyway, you strangled her. When Keeley came to collect for himself, you strangled him too." Mrs. Renner's face went white as porcelain. "That's ridiculous," she managed, but her voice cracked halfway through. "It is inevitable," Wolf corrected. "You failed to consider, however, that Keeley left behind more than one copy of the evidence. You were sloppy. Your own husband," Wolf's gaze shifted to Mr. Renner, who sat rigid and silent, "tried to burn what he could find, but it was too late. The damage was done." Kramer straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing at Mrs. Renner. "You've got proof of this?" he demanded. Wolf allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. "Of course. Mr. Goodwin." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope Wolf had given me earlier. Letters, photographs, and an unsigned note that left very little to the imagination. "Found in a safe deposit box registered to Miss Latham," I said. "Neatly indexed. All about the Renner affair." Mrs. Renner let out a soft, strangled sound and buried her face in her hands. Wolf picked up his beer and took a measured sip before delivering the final line. "I suggest, Inspector, that you escort Mrs. Renner to your offices. She should not be difficult to convince. The evidence is self-explanatory. Now, if you'll excuse me, my orchids are waiting." Kramer rose, already signaling his men outside. "About damn time," he muttered. When it comes to dramatic exits, Wolf always prefers the subtle kind, which is to say, no exit at all. While Kramer and his men led a shaken Mrs. Renner out the door, Wolf merely adjusted his cuffs, took another sip of beer, and glanced at the remaining guests as though they were flies buzzing around his orchids. Caroline Desmond dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Renner sat motionless, hollow-eyed, like he'd been carved out of marble. Dr. Ames, for his part, allowed himself the faintest smirk, apparently vindicated now that he was no longer the police's chosen goat. Brett, who'd managed to stay invisible through most of Wolf's summation, finally rose and looked around like a man who had wandered into the wrong room and only just noticed. He started, his voice a croak. I can't believe it was her. Wolf shut his eyes, already reaching for the orchid catalogue that had been sitting on the corner of his desk since morning. Believe it, he murmured. One should never underestimate the power of fear, Mr. Brett. Or of vanity. Or of the lengths to which a person will go to preserve both. Kramer stomped back in briefly to bark a few parting words. Wolf, he said, you could have saved us all a lot of trouble by calling me sooner. Next time. Next time, Wolf interrupted with just enough ice in his tone to freeze the conversation. You might try asking the correct questions before arresting the incorrect man. It would save me considerable trouble. Kramer muttered something under his breath about blowhard, and left in a huff. That, of course, was Wolf's cue to rise, which he did, slowly, with the air of a man who has just completed something far beneath him and is eager to move on to something worthy of his attention. Mr. Goodwin, he said without looking at me, please see that our guests find their way out. And when you're finished, join me in the plant rooms. I trust one can now return to the proper business of the day. Yes, sir, I said. One by one, the remaining suspects left, offering a few awkward words and avoiding each other's eyes as they went. Even Brett managed a weak nod before disappearing into the hallway, still looking like he'd walked through a nightmare in broad daylight. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, the brownstone fell quiet again, just the way Wolf liked it.
I lingered in the office for a moment, letting the silence settle before grabbing my hat.
The photograph of Joan and Keeley still sat on Wolf's desk, along with the stack of letters and notes that had sealed Mrs. Renner's fate. I glanced at them and shook my head. Murder, seances, blackmail, all tangled up like strings on a puppet, waiting for Wolf to snip the right one. I switched off the office light and headed toward the plant rooms, where I could already hear Wolf talking to Fritz about the new hybrids blooming on the north wall. And that's the way it always goes. The world outside can strangle itself with its own secrets, and Wolf, from the safety of his brownstone, untangles it all without ever breaking a sweat. Me. I just take notes, herd suspects, and wait for the next curtain to rise. I paused in the doorway to the plant rooms, and couldn't resist tossing a line over my shoulder before joining him. All right, big man, I said. Another killer caught, another day's work done. Now, how about you let me pick the beer this time? Wolf didn't even bother to look at me. Mr. Goodwin, he said evenly, you may pick the beer when I have ceased picking the orchids. That is to say, never. I grinned. Business as usual. With Kramer and his men gone and Mrs. Renner safely on her way to an all-expenses-paid stay at the city jail, the office settled into the kind of silence Wolf considered sacred. The suspects, or what was left of them, filed out with the awkwardness of people leaving a funeral. Caroline Desmond kept her eyes down, barely murmuring a goodbye. Mr. Renner looked 20 years older than he had when he walked in, though he managed to mutter something about gratitude to Wolf, who ignored him completely. Dr. Ames, of course, wore the faintly smug look of a man who knows he's just escaped the noose and intends to savor it. When the door finally clicked shut behind the last of them, I dropped into my chair with a sigh. Wolf was already halfway through his beer. You know, I said, you could at least pretend to enjoy humiliating Kramer. Maybe crack a smile once in a while. He raised an eyebrow without looking at me. I enjoy nothing that requires such tedious exertion, Mr. Goodwin. But the work is necessary. That was as close as he'd come to bragging. I glanced at the photographs still lying on his desk, Joan Latham and Keeley, caught in their little conspiracy, and now both on the wrong end of a strangler's hands. You really had her pegged from the start, didn't you? I asked. Wolf leaned back, steepling his fingers. It was inevitable, he said. The others had motive, yes, fear, anger, greed, but only Mrs. Renner had the means and the resolve. Her slip of the tongue merely confirmed what her behavior had already revealed. He closed his eyes, savoring his victory. Most murderers, he continued, are undone not by what they conceal, but by what they cannot help but reveal. That's poetic, I said. You been reading verse on the sly? He snorted. Beer, he replied, is my only indulgence. Fritz appeared at the doorway just then, announcing that dinner was ready, trout amandine with asparagus. Wolf heaved himself to his feet with the dignity of a man who's just settled the world's troubles and is now prepared to eat his weight in butter. As he passed me, he paused just long enough to deliver one last line. "I trust you have taken adequate notes, Mr. Goodwin." I dislike repeating myself. I gave him a little salute. "Every word, boss." And that's how it ended. Another body or two, another round of suspects sent packing, and Wolf back to his orchids and his trout as though nothing had happened. Me. I stayed behind for a moment, looking at the photo on the desk. Joan, Keeley, Mrs. Renner, all tangled up in their own lies until Wolf came along and cut the string. Then I grabbed my hat, turned out the lights, and followed the smell of butter into the dining room. Business as usual. The brownstone felt almost too quiet once everyone was gone, even Kramer. I stood in the office doorway for a moment, hat in hand, watching Wolf as he sat behind his desk. He'd already reached for one of his books, Orchidaceae of Guatemala, and opened it with a kind of reverence that nobody in his right mind would have dared interrupt. But I, of course, am rarely in my right mind. "You know," I said, leaning on the doorframe, "you make it look easy. 2 murders, a room full of liars, Kramer breathing fire, and you just sit there like the whole thing's a puzzle you already finished yesterday." Wolf didn't look up. "It was easy," he replied evenly. "Once Mrs. Renner betrayed herself, the rest followed naturally. That crack she made, it was her own fault?" "That," Wolf said, finally glancing at me, "and everything that preceded it. The contradictions. The little vanities. The fear. People like Mrs. Renner cannot help but reveal themselves, no matter how determined they are to conceal their sins. They are like children playing a game they do not understand." He closed the book softly, laid it on the desk, and reached for his beer. "2 lives," he continued, "snuffed out because a woman refused to bear the consequences of her own choices. It is vulgar." I gave a low whistle. "Vulgar maybe," I said, "but she sure put up a good front. Right until the end." Wolf let out a short, dismissive snort and took a sip of beer. "I have never," he said, "found a facade to be worthy of admiration. Show me a fact." We sat for a moment in silence, him with his book and beer, me thinking about Joan Latham and Keeley and Mrs. Renner, all tangled up in their little web. Finally I straightened, putting on my hat. "Well," I said, "case closed. Police happy, killer caught, orchids unmolested. Guess it's just another day in paradise." Wolf grunted, which, coming from him, might have passed for agreement. I flicked off the office light and headed toward the hall, tossing one last line over my shoulder just to hear it bounce off his ego. "You know," I said, "one of these days you're gonna have to let me solve one without you." From behind me came the faintest sound of a chuckle, quiet and quick, before his voice followed, cool as ever. "That," Wolf said, "is not a day I intend to live to see." And with that, the brownstone settled back into its usual rhythm, orchids upstairs, dinner on the table, and Wolf in his chair, unmoved by the storm he'd just ended. For me, I just made sure the door was locked, my notes were typed, and that there was still beer left in the fridge for tomorrow.
비즈니스 as usual.